Something has been shifting in America, but not in a way that shows up clearly in the headlines. It shows up in smaller moments, in grocery aisles where prices feel unfamiliar, in workplaces where people still have jobs but no longer feel secure in them, in the constant background tension that makes everyday decisions feel heavier than they used to be. For a long time, many people assumed this feeling was personal. They thought that maybe they were just stressed or falling behind or not managing things well enough. But when millions of people start describing the same pressure using the same words, it stops being an individual problem. It becomes a pattern. What is happening right now is not a sudden collapse. It is not a single crisis you can point to. It is something quieter and in many ways more unsettling. Multiple systems, including money and technology and safety, are all tightening at the same time. Each one on its own might be manageable together. They leave very little room to breathe. That is why anger has been rising. Not an explosive anger, but a deeper kind. The kind that comes from constantly adjusting and constantly paying attention and constantly trying not to make a mistake, because the margin for error feels thinner than ever. This video is not about blaming one group or one policy, and it is not a rant. It is an attempt to step back and connect the dots to explain why life feels harder now, even when it seems like you are doing everything right. Because once you see the pattern, something important happens. The confusion starts to fade, and the pressure finally begins to make sense. On the surface, everything is supposed to be fine. Turn on the news and you will hear familiar reassurances. Inflation is cooling. The economy is still growing. Unemployment remains relatively low. By traditional measurements, none of this looks like a crisis. And that is exactly why so many people feel confused by their own experience. Because daily life does not feel fine. There is a growing disconnect between what the numbers say and what households feel. People are still working. Many are even earning slightly more than they were a few years ago. Yet somehow that effort does not translate into relief. The bills still feel heavier. The margin for error still feels thinner. And the sense of stability that used to come with doing everything right is quietly fading. Part of the problem is how averages work. Economic indicators are designed to describe the whole country at once, but they often smooth over the extremes. When costs rise unevenly, insurance here, groceries there, utilities somewhere else, the pain does not always show up as a dramatic spike. It shows up as friction, constant low-level friction that wears people down over time. Surveys reflect this gap clearly. A significant share of Americans now say that the cost of living, not unemployment and not taxes and not even health care, is their single biggest financial concern. That matters because perception shapes behavior. When people feel financially squeezed, even without a clear crisis event, they become cautious and anxious and defensive. And when official narratives do not match the lived reality, trust starts to erode. It creates a strange psychological tension. You are told the economy is improving, yet your own experience suggests the opposite. That contradiction forces people to question themselves first. Am I mismanaging my money? Am I overreacting? Am I just not keeping up? But when that same question is being asked by millions of people at the same time, the issue stops being personal. It becomes structural. This is how frustration quietly builds. Not from one shocking event, but from the feeling of being gaslit by optimism that does not line up with everyday life. When reassurance replaces explanation, anger does not disappear. It just goes underground. And this illusion of normalcy is dangerous because it delays honest conversations about what is actually changing beneath the surface. The economy may still be functioning, but the experience of living inside it has fundamentally shifted. That shift becomes even clearer when we look at the one place people expect stability the most: work. For a long time, work was the anchor. If you had a job, especially a full-time one, you had a sense of direction, a sense that even if things were not perfect, you were at least standing on solid ground. That feeling has changed. Today, many people are technically employed, yet they do not feel secure. The anxiety is not loud or dramatic. It is subtle. A constant awareness that roles can be restructured and teams can be optimized and entire departments can disappear with very little warning. Stability has quietly shifted from something you earn over time to something that feels conditional. Part of this unease comes from how layoffs now happen. They no longer arrive only during recessions or obvious downturns. Companies report profits and executives talk about efficiency, and still the jobs vanish. When more than 1 million layoffs are announced in a single year, even outside a formal crisis, people start to internalize a new rule. Performance alone does not guarantee safety. And then there's the rise of automation. The fear around artificial intelligence is not really about machines replacing humans overnight. It is about something more precise and more unsettling. Artificial intelligence does not replace jobs because people are bad at them. It replaces tasks because they are predictable. Billing and scheduling and coding and transcription and claims processing. Work that once required training and experience is increasingly handled quietly in the background by systems that do not need breaks or benefits or explanations. This is why the anxiety feels different from past technological shifts. It is not limited to factory floors or entry-level roles. It reaches into offices and hospitals and professional careers that were once considered safe. When studies suggest that a significant share of jobs could be automated or fundamentally reshaped within this decade, that uncertainty seeps into everyday thinking. People do not talk about it loudly at work, but they feel it. They double-check emails. They hesitate before pushing back. They stay later than necessary, not to get ahead, but to avoid being noticed for the wrong reason. This kind of pressure does not show up on a resume, but it changes behavior. It makes people risk-averse and less creative and more exhausted. And when work, something that once provided structure and identity, starts to feel unstable, the stress does not stay at the office. It follows people home. It shapes how they spend and how they plan and how much uncertainty they believe they can afford. This is where the conversation about artificial intelligence and the future of work becomes real. Not as a headline, but as a daily psychological weight. And when income feels uncertain, even temporarily, every other pressure becomes harder to absorb. Which brings us to the next layer, the one people feel most immediately every single month. For many people, the pressure does not arrive as one dramatic financial blow. It shows up in smaller and relentless ways. Groceries cost a little more than expected. Insurance renewals arrive higher without much explanation. Utilities creep up. Subscriptions quietly increase. None of these changes feel catastrophic on their own, but together they create a constant sense of strain. Like carrying extra weight that never gets set down. What makes this especially frustrating is that people are trying. They budget and they cut back and they compare prices and they delay purchases. And yet the relief never really comes. The math just does not work the way it used to. Wages have technically risen in recent years. On paper, the paychecks look slightly better. But when those increases are measured against everyday costs, the picture changes. Real purchasing power has barely improved. In some cases, it has gone backwards. That is why earning more does not feel like progress. It feels like running in place. Insurance has become a particularly sharp example of this shift. Auto and home premiums have risen far faster than most people expect, often outpacing general inflation. These are not optional expenses. You cannot simply opt out without taking on serious risk. So households absorb the increase quietly, even when it throws off their entire monthly balance. Food tells a similar story. Prices at the grocery store remain significantly higher than they were before the pandemic. Even as inflation headlines suggest improvement, people adjust by buying cheaper brands or smaller portions or fewer extras. Over time, that constant calculation becomes exhausting. What is happening underneath all of this is subtle but important. Many companies are relying on fatigue. They know most people do not have the time or energy to scrutinize every bill or challenge every fee or constantly switch providers. Small increases slip through because life is already demanding enough. This is where anger starts to mix with something else. Shame. People blame themselves for struggling even though the system has become far less forgiving. Surviving now requires near-perfect attention. Miss one detail or overlook one adjustment, and the consequences feel immediate. This is why the cost of living crisis in America does not feel like a headline problem. It feels personal. It is the quiet realization that stability now requires constant vigilance, and that rest itself has become a luxury. And when money feels this tight, even small disruptions carry more weight. This makes every other source of uncertainty, especially safety and social stability, feel far more threatening. Beyond work and money, there is another layer of pressure that is harder to measure, but just as powerful. A growing sense that everyday life feels more fragile than it used to. For many people, this is not about a single traumatic event. It is about atmosphere. A background tension that follows them into places that once felt routine. Public transit and shopping centers and schools and even social gatherings. The world has not suddenly become unfamiliar, but it feels less predictable. And unpredictability is what triggers fear. What is striking is how normalized this feeling has become. News cycles move quickly, tragedies blur together. Each incident is treated as isolated, yet the emotional impact accumulates. Over time, people stop reacting with shock and start reacting with caution. They scan rooms, they plan exits, they weigh risks that used to feel abstract. Surveys reflect this shift. A growing share of Americans report feeling less safe in public spaces than they did just a few years ago. That perception matters regardless of how individual statistics are debated. Safety is not only about numbers, it is about trust. Trust that systems will respond and that institutions are functional and that daily routines will not suddenly turn threatening. This erosion of trust has consequences. It changes how people socialize and how often they leave home and what they allow their children to do independently. It narrows life in quiet ways, shrinking freedom without any official rule ever being written. And when life already feels financially tight and professionally uncertain, this added layer of fear hits harder. People have less emotional bandwidth to absorb it. There is no cushion left. Every risk feels amplified because the cost of something going wrong feels higher than it used to be. What makes this especially exhausting is the lack of resolution. There is no clear finish line and no sense that things will go back to normal. Instead, vigilance becomes a habit, a permanent setting rather than a temporary response. This is not about panic. It is about fatigue. Living in a state of low-level alert drains people over time. It steals joy from ordinary moments and replaces it with calculation. And when safety, like money and work, starts to feel uncertain, people begin to ask a deeper question, not just about danger, but about control. Who is actually in charge of protecting everyday life? And what happens when the answer feels unclear? That question leads directly into the next shift. Many people are sensing the feeling that control itself is slowly moving away from the individual. Alongside financial strain and growing unease, there is another feeling that keeps surfacing. One that is harder to articulate but deeply unsettling. A sense that decisions are increasingly being made for people, not with them. In many areas of daily life, individuals no longer interact with another human being. They interact with systems and automated processes and policies enforced by software. If something goes wrong, there is often no clear path to explanation or appeal, just a notification or a denial or a scripted response. On its own, this might seem like progress or efficiency or modernization or convenience. But over time, it creates a very different emotional response. People do not feel served by these systems. They feel managed by them. Technology has become an invisible authority layer. Algorithms decide credit limits and insurance pricing and job screening and content visibility and even access to basic services. The logic behind these decisions is rarely transparent. And when outcomes feel unfair or arbitrary, frustration has nowhere to go. This is where the language of compliance starts to appear, not necessarily because people oppose rules, but because they feel excluded from the process that creates them. Consent quietly gives way to obligation. Choice narrows and the ability to push back feels limited. What makes this especially destabilizing is that it touches almost every part of life at once. Workflows are automated. Customer service is reduced. Bureaucratic steps multiply. Each interaction feels small, but together they create a sense of being boxed in by systems that do not see context or nuance or humanity. For many people, this loss of control triggers a defensive reaction. Not always logical and not always productive, but deeply human. When individuals feel powerless, they look for ways to reclaim agency, even symbolically. That is why resistance often shows up as emotion before it shows up as action. Anger in this context is not just about policy or technology. It is about dignity, about wanting to be treated as a participant in society, not a variable in the optimization model of someone else. And when people already feel stretched thin financially and professionally and emotionally, that loss of agency becomes the breaking point. It turns pressure into resentment and fatigue into defiance. This is the moment when frustration stops being quiet. When people stop internalizing blame and start questioning the structure itself. And once that shift happens, the situation feels fundamentally different from past periods of stress, because it is no longer just about surviving the present. It is about what kind of future is being built and who gets a say in shaping it. That realization sets the stage for the final question this moment forces us to confront. Why does this period feel so much heavier than the ones before it? People have lived through difficult periods before: economic downturns and political tension and rapid technological change. None of these forces are new on their own. And yet for many Americans, this moment feels heavier and more draining than anything they remember. The difference is not just what is happening, it is how it is happening. First, there is the speed. Change used to arrive in phases. There was time to adjust and to learn and to rebuild routines. Today, the systems update faster than people can emotionally or financially adapt. Prices change. Jobs evolve. Technologies roll out. Rules shift. Before one adjustment fully settles, another one arrives. The ground does not just move, it stays unstable. Then there is the overlap. In previous eras, pressure often came from one dominant source at a time. A recession might bring job losses, but costs were lower. Inflation might rise, but employment felt secure. Now the pressures stack on top of each other. Work feels uncertain at the same time that money feels tight. Daily life feels more fragile, while technology quietly reshapes how decisions are made. There is no single area where people feel protected enough to relax. But what truly sets this moment apart is the absence of a recovery narrative. In the past, hardship usually came with a promise. Even if it was vague: work hard and hang on and things will stabilize. That belief created psychological endurance. Today, many people feel like they are permanently in adjustment mode, always budgeting and always reskilling and always monitoring risk, never quite reaching a point where effort turns into security. This creates a specific kind of exhaustion, not panic and not collapse, but long-term depletion. The kind that builds when life becomes a constant exercise in damage control, when attention itself becomes a survival tool, when a single missed detail at work or in finances or in daily decisions can have outsized consequences. Over time, this changes how people think. They stop asking how to move forward and start asking how to avoid falling behind. Hope gives way to caution. Optimism gives way to calculation. Trust erodes not necessarily in one institution, but in the system as a whole. That is why the anger surfacing now feels different. It is not impulsive. It is not ideological. It is the emotional residue of prolonged pressure without relief, a response to the feeling that the rules have changed quietly and unevenly and without consent. And once that realization takes hold, people stop waiting for reassurance. They start questioning the trajectory itself. Because if nothing eases and if nothing slows, the real concern is not just how hard life feels today. It is what living like this year after year ultimately does to a society. None of this means America is broken beyond repair, but it does mean something important has shifted. What people are reacting to right now is not a single policy or a single technology or a single economic chart. It is the accumulation of pressure. The feeling that everyday life now demands constant attention and constant adjustment and constant resilience without offering much certainty in return. When work feels less stable and money stretches less and safety feels fragile and systems feel distant, frustration becomes inevitable, not because people are unwilling to adapt, but because adaptation has become permanent. There is no pause and no clear moment where effort turns into relief. Understanding this pattern matters because anger without clarity turns inward. It becomes blame or resentment or exhaustion. But anger with understanding becomes something else. It becomes awareness, and awareness is the first step toward regaining agency individually and collectively. This moment is not defined by collapse. It is defined by a question. How long can systems stay this tight before something gives? And what happens if nothing meaningfully loosens? The answers will not come from pretending everything is fine. They will come from recognizing what people are actually experiencing and why so many are starting to speak up at the same time. So the real takeaway is not fear. It is attention, because when patterns become visible, they can also be challenged. And the most important thing to remember is this: if life feels harder than it used to feel, you are not imagining it, and you are not alone.